Because if you're not there, you have to go to
Right.
to pick it up.
Actually, I'm okay. I'm going to be there. It's going to be the 22nd. I hope so. But yeah, I'm okay. I know him.
If you don't read it, then you change all your equipment.
Where you want us, Ken?
Right?
How you doing? How's everybody? Yeah. How's everybody?
How you doing, man?
Nice.
I have a picture of my heart.
Yeah.
The after party.
Don't hang out with this guy. Get you in trouble. Yeah, thank you.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thanks for coming to Jazz at Lincoln Center. It's wonderful to have you all here. And of course, we're very excited tonight and very honored that you could join us. We're here to celebrate and to listen to and to discuss a couple of different projects with some amazing people. Of course, the listening part is a new CD, The Storyteller, which I'm sure you all know about,
Yes.
and a wonderful new book, autobiography, or biography, autobiography? Autobiography, African Rhythms. And we are, of course, joined by journalist and arts administrator, is that still arts administrator?
All of that.
And arranger, Mr. Willard Jenkins. And of course, the leader of the recording, the autobiography, if that's a word, and a composer and arranger and a legend, Mr. Randy Weston.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, starting with the book, I know it's a wonderful formation of the credits, and I thought we would start there. The book is composed by Randy Weston and arranged by Willard Jenkins. And Willard, if I could start with you, what is involved in arranging a Randy Weston composition?
Well, first off, let me say that whole idea came as a result of the extensive interviews that we did. Obviously, in doing those extensive interviews, Melba Liston was going to be one of the real touchstones of as far as important people in Randy's life. And any of you who know about Melba Liston, you know that Melba Liston was Randy Weston's longtime arranger. She arranged many of his major works and worked with him tirelessly down through the years, even when she became physically incapacitated. And as I interviewed Randy and he told me how they worked together and their relationship, it became clear to me that the way that he and Melba worked together in shaping his compositions was parallel and very similar. Now, I'm not in any way, shape, or form going to correlate myself with Melba Liston. But the way that he worked with Melba was very similar to the way we worked to put together this book. So one day I said, well, you know, as opposed to the usual as told to kind of thing, I said, why don't we do this composed by and arranged by? And he appreciated the idea, so that's what we did.
If Candido is joining us. Candido? And Randy, you and I remember talking at one point when this project started. What was it like? For you, it seems like to me that the past, the future, they're all in one. Everything seems there. You can access all these things at the same time. But the process of going through and doing the interviews with Willard, how was that for you? Was it what you expected?
Well, you know, Willard, tell the story, Willard, about how. No, it's important because he came to me. He said, I want to write your book, right? So how did you happen to do that?
Well, you know, one of the important aspects of that, one of the things that brought us together was in '95, Randy did the invitation series at the Montreal Jazz Festival. And the invitation series is a series where they bring one artist to do multiple evenings in different contexts. Of course, that takes a special artist, an artist who's had various configurations and various relationships with different artists down through his career. So we really met then. We had met before, but we met and we really connected then, because I remember that there was a press conference that we went to, and it turned out that my wife and I were actually leaving on the day of his final night's concert. So after the press conference, my wife and I went up to him and shook his hand and said, Mr. Weston, we truly enjoyed your days, the nights we spent with you here in Montreal at the festival. And my wife said, but we're leaving today. And he said, well, you can't leave. He said, we're going to Africa tonight. And that Saturday night happened to be the night that he was performing with the Ganawa. So Randy and I are still standing there talking, and Randy looks at me and says, who is this guy looking me in the eye? Because we're about the same height. So we're standing there talking, and meanwhile, my wife has gone off to parts unknown. I'm not sure where she's going off to run an errand or whatever. A few minutes later, she comes back and she says, we're not leaving. She says, I've got us rebooked into the hotel, and I changed our reservation, because that was back in the days when you didn't have to pay a penalty for changing your reservation. She changed the reservation, so we stayed that night. And at that festival, at that particular moment, that's when we really connected. And, it was at a point where I wanted to do a work like this. And so I broached the subject, and he was all for it. And we spent years doing interviews, extensive interviews. We went to Morocco and different places, and we did interviews on a variety of different subjects, and, we took it from there.
Had you been thinking about doing something like this?
Yes, I had, because actually in the 70s, I lived in North Africa 7 years. And I traveled to 18 countries in Africa, and always looking for the oldest music I could find, the traditional people I wanted to find, So I met so many incredible people that I wanted to document that. So I had already started doing some things, but never really finalized until I met Willard, And like he said, we looked each other in the eye. And he says, I want to do your book. I said, well, let's do it. And that's how it started. Yeah.
Now, the title of the book is African Rhythms. Yeah. Obviously, I think we all are familiar with a lot of your work. That's central to what you do and who you are. And I know your father was very aware of his African roots. How was that transmitted to you as a young man?
Well, I grew up in a very rich area of Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. That was during a time of segregation, you see. So we couldn't go to hotels, we couldn't go to restaurants, so we had our village right in Brooklyn. And growing up with people like Max Roach, Cecil Plain, Duke Jordan, U.B. Blake, Herman Chittison, Ernie Henry, Duke Joe, I go on and on and on. There was so many great musicians. And it was a period when there was no television and no disco. Everything was live, you see. So my mother I had the black church on Sunday, the big band concerts, we go to dances. You go Calypso, Palladium. So it was total music, you know. And our parents were the ones who took us to the Apollo Theater. Our parents were the ones who brought the best music in the house. It could have been Nat King Cole, it could have been Haley Jackson, it could have been an opera. But we grew up in a neighborhood that somehow, economically, most people were poor, but everybody had a piano. And every child, you had to take piano lessons or violin or trumpet or dance. Culture was a part of our life, you see. And I grew up in that kind of atmosphere. And I had to document this because the history of African people in this country is still not really known, you know. And somebody like Max Roach, I go to Max's house, he told me the importance of people like Baby Dodds. We talk about Buddy Bolden. We talk about the early people, Big Sid Catlett, you know. So we had this sense of history. My father, the people we grew up with, who were African people, what happened after we were taken to the United States, what happened when we came in contact with European languages, we came in contact with European instruments, European dancing, what happened to it, you see. And the spirit of Africa went into all of that, you know. And even up to today, I'm still trying to understand my mother and father, what they were thinking, how they had to survive, how they kept us spiritually healthy, how music was how we survived. Because without that music, we will never survive. Because it's hard to explain what it is in America to have a dark skin, to have what they call kinky hair, you know. And you grow up in a world when they say, well, you're inferior, your color is inferior, you know, you are nothing, you know. But our parents, that generation, they were kings and queens. They kept us royal, they kept us beautiful. And we were lucky to hear Ellington and Jimmy Lunsford and Coleman Hawkins and Louis Armstrong. We had the best music because everybody came to New York. And I was blessed by being born in New York City. So that's how it happened. And it was so important to document this incredible history of a people.
Talking about documentation, I mentioned that the percussionist in your group, Neil Clark, was in one of our classes yesterday. And he said something very interesting, and I think I've heard you say something similar, that the complexity of rhythm in African music is as great as the complexity of harmony in European music, but it's not documented.
That's true.
And I thought, I think I'd heard you say something similar, but could you talk about that, or do you discover that more and more as you listen to more
Well,
and more?
not only that, but the whole concept of harmony came out of African music. Because the traditional people, going back to the ancient Egyptian empire, where the ancient ancestors knew that music came from the universe, you know. And the universe is always swinging. The planets are always rotating. Each planet's got its own sound, you know. So way back then, our music was harmony, but it was harmony of souls, you see. So harmony was always there, but harmony in the African way, which is the traditional way, which is the oldest way, because African music is as old as Africa itself, you see. So when you go back to the beginning of music, you realize melody and rhythm and harmony was always there. But the harmony was, if I play some music and I harmonize these people, so it came out of Africa, harmony also. Yeah. And a good example of that is our giant here, Mr. Candido.
Absolutely.
And when Candido plays the drums, he's playing melody, he's playing rhythms, but he's also harmony. But it's African-Cuban harmony. And you hear the harmony, we hear those rhythms, you see. Yeah. So it's something, and I'm still learning, I tell you. Africa, Cuba, I'm still like a baby trying to understand this music because it's spirit. It's spirit. It's very deep, you know.
Willard, I mean, when Randy talks about music, when he speaks at all, there's a very distinctive voice, and you captured that in this book. Was there a trick to that, or was it just letting Randy's voice come through?
No, there was no trick to that. One of the beauties of this whole process is the fact that this man has tremendous recall. He has tremendous recall of going way, way back of all his experiences, and in wonderful and rich and colorful detail. And not only that, but I've told people this many times. He is a major, what we refer to as a pack rat. Because he saved everything. Now it's not as though it was in archival order. I don't want to fool you into thinking that. But whenever we would get together at his house, he was constantly pulling out some important document or recording or something that would take us down another avenue. And the same thing was true when we were interviewing. Because I learned after a while that whenever we interviewed, it was a good idea to double back and go back to some things that we had already covered, because it was clear that we probably hadn't covered it sufficiently, because each time it would spark something anew and some new relationship. He'd take me down some other avenue that we hadn't been. That's probably one reason why it took so long, but it was a long journey that was well worth it.
Randy, I remember there was one point, now in digging through all those things, I remember I was at your home once.
Oh, so you understand.
Well, that's why. And I remember that you needed to, there were a lot of videotapes that you hadn't seen in a long time. Did you remember what you had, or were you surprised by a lot of the things that were dug up?
Combination of both. Yeah. Because what happens, the early stuff, it's like, I go back to mom and pop, all our mothers and fathers, right? Sometimes they tell us something, and maybe 25 years later we get the message. That's the way Mother Nature works, right? So that also happens with the music. For example, I pulled out something I had not heard in a long time, Jimmy Lunsford's Yesterdays, featuring Freddie Webster on trumpet, If you've never heard it, it's one of the great classic examples of music, And I found it one day and I played it and I got so excited, I heard Freddie Webster the first time when he, Sarah Vaughan's first recordings, You're Not the Kind. And Freddie only played about 4 bars. But oh my God, the feeling, So things like that, and it's always like that with music.
All right, now hold on. You brought up Freddie Webster. So you got to tell the Miles Davis story, the Miles Davis Freddie Webster story.
Well, Freddie Webster was, we have so many great musicians of the 20s and 30s and 40s that have been ignored. Number one, I learned several things from Duke Ellington. Duke said there's no such thing as category in music. Duke said no such thing as modern music, which means that Louis Armstrong is 20th century music. Jimmy Lunsford is 20th century music. Dizzy Gillespie, 20th century music. So the way we look at it is a little different. So Louis was never old. If Louis Armstrong was alive today, he'd be a superstar, because nobody had the sound of Louis Armstrong. Nobody had the sound of Coleman Hawkins. You see, it was that sound that comes from the soul. So what happened when Freddie Webster died? At that time, I was running my dad's restaurant in Brooklyn, and I used to go to Max Roach's house almost every day. At Max's house, I met Charlie Parker, I met Dizzy Gillespie, I met Miles Davis, I met Max. I was at Max's house during the time he was doing Cabana Beat, Cabana Bop with George Russell, when they brought Chano Poser, the great African-Cuban drummer from Cuba, right? So I'm there. So finally, when Freddie died, I borrowed my father's car, and George Russell, Miles Davis, myself, Max Roach, we drove to Coney Island in Brooklyn, parked the car, we went to the beach, and Miles took out his trumpet, and he played over the Atlantic Ocean for Freddie Webster. See? And that's a spiritual thing of our music. That's me, is more important than the notes themselves, but all these giants were so spiritual and so giving, and nothing they wouldn't help you do. So that's the Miles Davis story.
So y'all see what I'm talking about?
Well, why don't we share some of the music from this recording? let's listen to High Fly because it's a very well-known composition, but also it features a wonderful solo by Benny Powell.
Oh, yes.
And I think this was Benny's last recording.
Last recording.
So let's.
And Benny Powell, he didn't take solos. He held a conversation. He told a story. And that's the giants of our music, who can improvise but tell you a story. And what he does on High Fly is something.
the whole thing is very beautiful. Just the simplicity and the beauty of the melody.
Oh,
We should mention, the CD is, as I mentioned, called The Storyteller, as you can hear, recorded live right next door at Dizzy's Club Coca-Cola last December.
yeah.
And the group's coming back in, actually, to launch the CD officially.
End of January.
End of January.
Yeah.
So you can all come. Sorry, Benny Powell.
Yeah, Benny Powell, yeah. Well, you heard that was a conversation. That wasn't a solo. He was talking, you could feel it. Because for me, the most important thing in music is spirit and feeling, you know. And that's why people ask, say, man, how did you start to play jazz music, you know? He said, well, first you got to be able to play the blues. You got to be play for a woman. And the reason for that, because the woman represents the earth. My mother carried me 9 months, as big as I am, you know. But what she was listening to and what she was doing had a lot of impact on what I do. So the whole point was that when you play this music, all the giants, you get it here, not here, you get it here. And Benny Powell was a perfect example of that. Yeah.
We are, of course, as we've pointed out, very honored to be joined by another giant this evening, Candido.
Oh, yes.
And
Oh, yes.
you had a concert, please. You performed a very special concert a few weeks ago in Tribeca. In Tribeca, could you tell us a bit about that? It was a great album.
Thank you very much. We did this recording in 1960, and it was during that time when I was you see, my mother, my dad, Jamaica, Panama, Maroon, my father, he was a revolutionary guy, very proud. My mother from Virginia. So I had this fire from my father and that quiet fire from my mother, you know. But I grew up in the area of Bed-Stuy where we had African people from different places, from Trinidad, from Jamaica, from Senegal, from Virginia, you know. And the whole idea of colonialism was to separate us and put us into categories, you see. But my father, he loved Marcus Garvey very much. And he also kept books on African history in the house, completely contradicting what we saw in the movies and the images of Africa. We never got the true history of African people. So I grew up with that kind of pride, you know. So when I became a composer, I wanted one day to create a work of music that would put together African people from different parts of the globe, right? So Uhuru was very special. First of all, I was so happy to have the great Candido. On congas, we had Amanda Peraza on bongos. We had Max Roach playing marimba. We had Charlie Persip on drums. We had Ron Carter on bass, George DeVivier on bass. The trumpet section was Freddie Hubbard, Richard Williams, Benny Bailey, and who else?
In the trumpet section, Clark Terry.
Clark Terry. Trumpet section.
Oh, don't forget Olatunji in the rhythm section.
Yeah. And the trombone section was Quentin Jackson, Slide Hampton, Jimmy Cleveland. We had Julius Watkins on French horn. The reed section was Yusef Lateef, G.G. Grice, Cecil Payne, Jerome Richardson, Sahib Shahab. We had Les Spann on flute and guitar. We had Kenny Burrell also on guitar. And we had two singers, Martha Flowers, who was in the classical tradition, but she was a great soprano singer, and Brock Peters, who was a folk singer and actor. And we had Babatunde Olatunji on percussion. And Melvin Liston did the arrangements. And we used Kiswahili. We got Richard Langston Hughes. We asked Langston Hughes to write a freedom poem for us. And I met a man at the United Nations from Tanzania named Tutemeke Sanga. And he translated Langston's poetry from English to Kiswahili. And the movements were, first of all, Uhuru Kwanzaa, which meant freedom first. Second movement was called African Lady. dedicated to our mothers, our daughters, our sisters, our cousins, all those women that never get the credit. They're always in the background, right? The third movement was called Bantu. The last movement was called Kucheza Blues, which meant that the day that African people get recognized for their contribution to this planet, we're going to have a big party with rhythms from Trinidad and Cuba and Jamaica and Brooklyn and Mississippi. And we're going to have a whole party, right? So Melba did the arrangements, and we did this recording in 1960. And ironically, 17 African countries got their independence in 1960. So this is the 50th anniversary of that. Now, the only ones left are the original orchestra. Thank God Candido was there. We did a Tribeca. Charlie Persip was there. Ron Carter's still with us. And Clark Terry,
Yusuf.
Yeah, and who?
Yusuf Lateef.
Yes, Yusuf Lateef was still with us, So it was quite symbolic, and we had an incredible orchestra. I can't name everybody in the orchestra, but I can tell you one thing. He stole the show. And I called him on the phone. I said, man, I'm the band leader. And Candido, he gave us a lesson of only the elders and ancestors can give us.
Yes.
That music must have spirit.
Yes.
Music must have feeling. Music has to have harmony and balance and connected to the universe, And Candido gave us all of that. Thank you, my brother.
And not only that, with a matching leopard jacket and hat.
So that was 1960. Your first trip to Africa was soon after that, right?
Yeah, 1961. Yeah, went to Nigeria. With 29 of us. Lionel Hampton had 8 members of his band. I took with me Booker Irvin and Scobie Stroman. And Nina Simone went on that trip, Ahmed Abdul Malik, Hale Woodruff, Martha Flowers, Hale Woodruff, Natalie Hinduras, 2 dancers from the Savoy Ballroom. And we spent 10 days in Lagos to see what the relationship between the traditional dance, traditional music, philosophy, art, between the Nigerians and African Americans.
And Jeffrey Holder, was Jeffrey Holder?
Jeffrey Holder, can't leave out Jeffrey. Of course, Jeffrey was there too. So it was an incredible experience, really. It was really going back home and make you really realize how young America is and how little we know about civilizations that have lasted for 10,000 years, of culture and civilization. It was a powerful experience.
These days, we hear people talk about world music or Afrobeat, and it seems like it's just any music that's not American. How do you feel about the term world music or what it encompasses? Because African music isn't one thing.
Not at all, no. Well, the way I see it, globally speaking, it's because we all come from Africa, the whole human race started from Africa and migrated. And we changed according to Mother Nature, because Mother Nature gives us the colors and the shape and the size, et cetera, et cetera. But looking at it, it seems that Africa should have died with the colonialism, slavery, drought. So much happened to this continent, right? But for me, that the way Mother Africa survived is when you hear the bossa nova in Brazil, when you hear the African music in Cuba, when you hear the steel band in Trinidad, when you hear the blues in Mississippi. So for me, that's Mother Africa still feeding the planet of spirituality through her music, And the proof of that is that we can all play together, no problem. First time I saw Candela, we played together because it's the same music, just variations of this incredible continent that created music, And I have to point out that people say to me, why Africa? Because Africa is the most diverse place on the planet Earth. It's the spiritual center of our planet. And I think, for me, before man ever arrived, Africa was swinging. And early man listened to the insects, the sounds of the birds, because Mother Nature's original orchestra. And that's why the music is so rich, because the music describes the continent itself. And if you go to North Africa or West Africa, East Africa, as soon as you touch the continent, the music changes. The music goes like this, because Africa is like this, you see. And so it's like that. So I'm discovering every day. Years ago, I used to collect those folkway, field cry hollows and prison songs, and I used to collect all that music. And I saw the whole connection, I said, wow, it's amazing, amazing.
And Willie, your first trip to Africa was once this project had started, right?
It was with him. I mean, it was clear that in talking to him, and we had done some interviews by that point, but it was clear that it was essential in understanding Randy and writing this book that I was going to have to travel to Africa with him, and specifically to Morocco, because Randy lived in Morocco for 6 years and did a lot of interesting things, including establishing an African Rhythms Club in Tangier, Morocco. And I remember it clearly. This is May of 2001, Memorial Day of 2001. It's an off day from work, so I'm sitting at home chilling, Phone rings, it's the familiar voice of Randy Weston. He don't say hello or nothing. He says, "Are you ready to go to Africa?" So I'm thinking to myself, yeah, right. I'll play along with this. I said, yeah, I'm ready. He said, okay, well, we leave on Thursday. So that's that. So that was the first experience, and that trip was when we did our first really extensive interviews, because it gave us an opportunity to be someplace where the phone wasn't going to ring. I mean, if you were at his house, the phone was ringing all the time, but the phone wasn't going to ring there. And we were brought over there by a film crew that was going to do a documentary on his life in Morocco and his experiences with the Moroccan people, specifically with the Gnawa people. And so that opened up a whole world to me, was this opportunity to spend this time with him, away from the daily connections and interruptions and all that, and to spend this time doing interviews and seeing the continent, this small part of the continent which meant so much to him, through his eyes. It was very important to describe it.
Do you still go back regularly to Morocco in particular?
No, I've been to Senegal twice this year. We're going back in a couple of weeks, actually, having a festival of World African Arts end of this month, But I go as much as I can, because when I go to Africa, I'm going to school, always. And whether I go to the desert, whether I go to the mountains, whether I go to the cities, I'm always looking for the oldest people I can find. I always try the oldest music I can find, because that way you have an understanding, what is African civilization? How did they create these incredible empires, We, myself and a bassist named James Lewis, we opened up the new library in Alexandria, Egypt, And when you travel in Egypt and you go down the Nile and you see these pharaohs, you see these enormous statues, with these African-American faces, pharaohs and kings and queens, So whenever I go there, I'm going to school. I'm still learning and will never know, because music is magic and Africa is magic. Yeah.
Let's listen to another track from the CD. I think we were Loose Wig or Wig Loose?
Loose Wig.
Loose Wig. Listen to a little bit of this.
Fatu's favorite.
Fatu's song.
not to deprive us all of CK Blue, but takes a beautiful solo there. But I do want, if people have some questions, I want to leave some time for that. And also, I wanted to ask you, you talk about what you've learned from African musicians and from the music of Africa, but do you have any sense of what African musicians may have learned from you over all the years you played with them?
Well, when I had the club in Tangier, it was great. 6 o'clock in the evening, we'd have, see what happens in Morocco, being close to Europe, you know, they usually got imitations of African-American music. So they would get music from Spain or from Italy, but they didn't get a chance to hear the real thing. So 6 o'clock in the evening, we'd have music on disc of Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Ray Charles, you know. And so we had that blues element there. Then at night, we'd play regular music. My son, Azadine, he was a great percussionist. We played together, sometimes with a dancer. Sometimes we'd have some singers from the Congo. Sometimes we have a blues band from Chicago. So the whole idea was, I guess maybe I gave Morocco in the sense that African people are global people. And all these rhythms that come from Africa, it's like when I play in Africa, I tell the African audience, I say, look, you may not recognize this music, but this is your music. After it left Africa and came in contact with different cultures and what we did to it. What happened when the first African saw saxophone, what he did with it. When the first African sat to a piano, I'd like to see what he did with it, you know. So that's how I get over it in a way. And the people understood, and we had festivals, and we would go down to Morocco and Marrakesh in the late 60s, and we would catch the folklore festivals. It was incredible. Musicians on camels playing music, on horseback playing music, different kind of instruments playing music. And you really realize the universality of music. And yet Africa is so diverse. A friend of mine, Leo Sarkeesian, he got a commission to do some music, traditional music in Guinea by Sekou Touré. And he said he traveled 20 miles in 2 years. That's as far as he got. There's so much diversity of music because Africa itself is diverse. And music comes from environment, you know. So the people in the desert, they're going to play the music about the desert. People in the mountains, they're going to create music about the mountains, you know. And you really understand, I think, a lot about music. Yeah.
If anyone has any questions, I'd love to take them.
Yes, I'd like to know, when you and Colonius Monk, when you went to his house, how was he like?
Beautiful. Beautiful.
You used to go there and sit down and talk. He didn't do much
Yeah.
talking.
Yeah, because see, when I heard him, I heard that magic. I heard Africa when I heard Monk play the piano.
Yeah.
I heard a sound because, you know, the wonderful thing about African American culture, because I always call African American classical music. Because this music was created on how African people approach other civilizations. So when I heard Monk play, I heard the pyramids, I heard ancient, I heard the universe, because he got certain sounds out the piano. And I heard him with Coleman Hawkins, because that was my love. Because of Coleman Hawkins, I discovered Hank Jones, I discovered Sir Charles Thompson, I discovered he's the first one to record Dizzy, first one to record, and Hawk went all the way back to Fletcher Henderson. So when I heard Body and Soul by Coleman Hawkins, I was about 17 years old. It's one of the greatest examples of music I ever heard in my life. And I got an advance from my father, and he gave me advance for 3 weeks. I bought 3 copies of Body and Soul. I put 2 copies in cellophane and hid them. The other copy I put on that turntable on a Saturday, loud, and open all the windows in the house. You can hear Body and Soul all on the street. So when I went to 52nd Street to hear Coleman Hawkins, he had this guy playing this piano. I didn't know who he was, you know. When I first heard him, I said, that guy can't play no piano. Because he was like, boom, and he was boom, you know. But I went back again, and I heard his music. I said, well, I got to know this guy. Because Ahmed Abdul Malik the great bass player. He used to take me down the North African section of Brooklyn. He'd take me to hear the oud and the qanun, those instruments where you can play in between the notes, right? And I was always trying to play like that on the piano. I could never find it. Monk was doing it. Went to his house, asked 1 hour questions, no response. Billie Holiday's picture in the middle of the ceiling. And the only thing he said to me, listen to all kinds of music, right? I went back a month later, he played the piano for me. And I spent 3 years hanging out with Monk, watching him, rehearsing what he'd say, what he would do. And after a while, I understood sound is so important in music. And we had that, you know. So you could tell an Ellington from a Basie, from a Nat King Cole, from an Art Tatum, just by their sound. And Monk had that sound. Our royalty. Yes.
We had another question over here.
Yeah, this is a question, I guess, for both of you, but mostly Willard. Randy speaks volumes, so I can't even imagine how you arranged that to come out with one book.
That was
how you arrived at the form, because there's interviews, and it's almost, I'm afraid to say it's African, but there is something very interesting about the oral sense that comes out, for me at least, in the book, because there's so many interviews with people such as Batu and everybody, that I felt like the people were speaking or in conversation maybe with Randy. So I'm just interested in the form and how you were able to end the book.
Well, you know, it came down to as far as those other people who were interviewed as part of the book. You know, ordinarily when you think of an autobiography, it's one voice. But it was clear in traveling with him and in meeting his friends and his colleagues and people who were important to his life, that they had something to say about him and about his importance to their lives that was very distinctive. So at certain points, there were people that I really wanted to interview to be a part of this, to explain some of the things that he was illustrating from their point of view. You know, so for example, when we talked about the Gnawa and the importance of his relationship with the Gnawa musicians, the Gnawa Spirit Music Brotherhood, as I characterize it, of Morocco, he introduced me to a good friend of his in Brooklyn, a woman named Khadija, a Moroccan woman. And I interviewed her, and she talked about how her mother had been fearful of the Gnawa. But for her, you know, she said when the Gnawa came around, her mother would close the shutters in the house and the whole thing. But that she'd go up to her room and concentrate on what they were doing. So having voices like that, I think, was very important to further illustrate the story and the beauty and colors of the various things that he was saying. And, you know, in putting together the whole book, you know, obviously I got these hours and hours of transcriptions and transcribed interviews. So it was kind of like a puzzle, you know, because as I say, certain things might be repeated at certain times during certain interviews. So, you know, I would have to go through the transcripts and say, okay, well, we want this part in part A, and this part in part B, and part B, number 1, number 2. So it was kind of a science to putting all this together. But that was one of the more fascinating aspects, as you point out, of bringing all this material together to make it a coherent read.
Yeah, we'll take 2 more.
I'm just curious, Willard, about from the beginning of this book to the end, is there anything that changed for your life?
Oh yeah, it opened up a whole world to me. It really opened up a whole world because for one thing, I had always longed to go to Africa. And as a kid, my mother used to always say, oh, I can't wait to go to Africa. I must go to Africa. Unfortunately, she became incapacitated before she was able to do that. So going with him opened up a new world for me. And, you know, since going with him, I've been back over a dozen times since that one time. You know, I've taken my family, my children have been, and the whole thing. So that opening up that world was very important. And Deirdre, I forgot, you talked about how did we decide to end it. Well, it ends with a chapter that's basically titled Randy Weston, Philosophically Yours. And that's something that he wrote that I tailored for the end of the book. And I said, hey, you know, does this work for you as far as being the way to end this book? And he agreed that that was how he wanted to end it.
Two quick questions. I didn't catch the name of the two pieces played again. What was the name of the first piece?
The first one was High Fly. The second one was Loose Wig.
High Fly.
I don't know whose wig was loose. He'll have to say that.
Combination.
In Loose Wig, like I heard a bunch of stuff, but I couldn't quite.
The percussion.
What
He wants to know what
percussion?
percussion was in the band on the album.
Oh, Lewis Nash on
the trap
drums.
drums.
On trap drums.
Louis Nash.
Yeah, Neil Clark was on percussion, and Alex Blake bass and percussion because he's both. And when Alex is from Panama, you see, and Neil Clark people is from Barbados, you see. So when Alex plays the bass, it's like in the African tradition because it's a string instrument, but at the same time you hear the drum, you know. So that's the rhythm section. Those cats can swing, man.
For those of you who are interested in the book and the CD, we have them both for sale over there. Willard and Randy will be hanging around for a little bit to sign books and CDs. I want to thank all of you for coming, in particular Candido for coming and joining us tonight. And please, it was an honor to have them here, and please help me thank Willard Jenkins and Randy Weston.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, that was a great hour, man.
Yep.
8:03.
I'm right. The trains run on time.